Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. This is the Hope Discovered podcast by ComQuest. My name is Bill. If you have never heard our podcast before, what we do here is we try to highlight things going on in the community around mental health, addiction, and other societal issues. Today, we are going to be covering the topic of suicide. So I do want to state a little bit of a trigger warning here. If this subject matter is going to be difficult for you, naturally, we want to give you a fair heads up that we are going to be talking about suicide. In the same breath, however, the hesitancy around talking about suicide has not served the issue well. And that's one of the things that we want to do in today's podcast is bring someone in who has done a lot of work for this cause, and this is Shannon Ortiz. Shannon, welcome to the program. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think that was perfectly said. Silence has never solved anything, is what I often say.
Yes, absolutely correct. A little bit about Light After Loss. We're going to talk about the Hope and Healing Center, which I know Shannon is very excited about. But as a backdrop, we have to talk a little bit about Light After Loss. It says, as part of their byline, that they are a trauma-focused support system for survivors of suicide loss, providing hope for healing through education, resources, and support services surrounding the grief and trauma of losing someone to suicide. Okay, let's just talk a little bit about you. Let the audience get to know you. Are you from the Stark County area originally, or?
I am not, but have been here long enough to where I feel as though I grew up in the Portage Lakes.
Oh, okay.
So
well, that's close enough.
Yeah, close enough, right? But as a counselor, I often say a baby counselor, I did my internship at Community Services of Stark County before it was ComQuest. That was way back in 2006. Okay. So, yeah, I've been in Stark County doing mental health since then. Yeah,
so you're very familiar with the field. Being from this area, just a fun little question. Are you a football fan?
I think you have to be. Isn't that a requirement?
Yeah, probably so.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. We like our football here.
Yes, we do.
Okay. As we move into the topic of suicide, we always want to mention the National Suicide Hotline, which is 1-800-273-8255. And once again, that's 800-273-8255. Tell me a little bit, and our listeners, a little bit about your life, what it was like just prior to the suicide.
So I was living my best life, I think. Like I said, I'm a clinical counselor and had landed at the University of Mount Union. I was the director of counseling services. It really was my dream job. I loved it. Very much a part of starting that program, especially the suicide prevention side. Mm-hmm. So at the time in college mental health, House Bill 28 was coming down the pike, and that was mandatory suicide prevention and postvention programming. So I got to develop that kind of stuff. I think I was the first QPR trainer, which is a suicide prevention gatekeeper trainer in Stark County, because we did that at Mount Union. Mm-hmm. And so, married, 2 girls. My husband was diagnosed with bipolar, but doing all the right things, going to counseling, medication management, we all have something we struggle with. So was doing okay and loved my career. My girls were going to be Purple Raiders, the whole kit and caboodle. Maybe minus the white picket fence. We didn't have a white picket fence.
Well, obviously, what most people would consider, the perfect life. And I say perfect, no one's life is perfect, but that's certainly the ideal that a lot of people strive for. This was your husband, and he took his life. Can you tell us a little bit about that incident and how it impacted you initially?
Yeah. As a, suicide prevention specialist at the time and involved in all of those things, it pretty much flipped my world upside down. So my husband, Craig, like I said, was diagnosed bipolar, bipolar 2, actually, if you want to get clinical, but was doing, again, all the right things, counseling, medication management. And our life was not easy per se. There were still ups and downs, and we called it the dance. Medication would work and then it wouldn't. And you kind of have to go back to the drawing board and adjustments and finding the right thing with the right dose. It's hard. It's very hard.
Sure.
So, but we were managing. And a lot of people who knew Craig didn't even know he was bipolar or struggling, because he was the funniest guy in the room. He was the party, not even just the life of the party. You invited Craig because he was the party. So when he died by suicide, people were just shocked.
Yeah.
Because here we are, well-educated, upper middle class, living our best lives, on the outside, you think it's all okay. And then your life gets flipped upside down. And so I really think my story is the epitome of mental illness and suicide do not discriminate.
Sure. I am nowhere near the expert that you are, but being the age that I am and have lived a while, there's been a couple of incidents that I have been aware of people taking their own life, and very commonly there's no warning. But I do want to back around to this because you are somewhat of a unique situation. You have an odd dichotomy in that your profession was so much around mental health and suicide prevention. It's kind of like the old saying about the cobbler's shoes.
Absolutely.
Yes. How did that impact you?
Yeah. Kind of going back to your statement that sometimes there aren't any signs, and that's absolutely true. So in the suicide prevention world and everything that I taught, 90% of the time there are some red flags or warning signs that kind of constitute a conversation. But then there are other times, the other 10% where there are no signs, or there are risk factors. Like Craig was at risk. He had a mental illness. He was going through a medication change. He had lost a job. Those are all risk factors, but I just saw him and he was okay. There was not anything that was a red flag and like, I need to ask him if he's thinking of taking his life right now.
Right.
A switch flipped per se.
Yes.
And, there was just no warning that switch had flipped. And by the time it flipped and he was gone, there was nothing we could do. So as, to answer the real question, it changed everything, my whole perception, because the number one question I get is, how do you even still believe in suicide prevention? I'm like, that's a great question. Therapy, number one, healing, number two. But at the end of the day, it is the 90%. So if somebody told me if you went up to the Roxino and pulled the lever and you had a 90% chance of winning the jackpot, I probably wouldn't be sitting here because 90%, I'll play those odds every day, right?
Sure.
Where I think what I learned is that the other 10% are still very devastating. And that's a lot of people, like 1,419 survivors every single day that don't have the necessary support. We do a lot around suicide prevention. We do very little around suicide postvention. So when Craig died by suicide, unless you were directly connected to me, there was nobody knocking on my door. There was, there's just no postvention support, or there wasn't anyway.
We talked at the beginning of the program about talking about suicide, and that's one of the things that I would say as a layperson in this field. One of the reasons why it should be discussed, because just because someone isn't saying something doesn't mean that they don't need to hear what they might need to hear to prevent this from happening. Before we go on to postvention, which is something that obviously Light After Loss is very much structured around, and it's what you became a part of in the wake of your husband's suicide, we should probably talk about the fact that a lot of people, if they start to get vibes, let's say, for example, there's a person in their family who is not behaving normally, they're giving away things, they're doing all the warning signs that can be a precursor to an act of suicide. The general rule is you do want to say something. I know a lot of people are afraid to because they're afraid they might instill that idea, where the fact of the matter is that idea is already there. It's already festering. And every research that I'm aware of has said that saying nothing is far worse. You do want to say something. Is that correct?
Absolutely. When in doubt, ask the question, which is a QPR kind of saying. And because you can't lead somebody in that direction. They're already headed in that direction. And oftentimes when you ask the question, it's kind of met with relief because they are giving signs in some way, even if it's not on purpose.
Yeah.
And to be able to talk about it and just open that door is, yes, I can talk about this and it's going to be okay. Just that weight is lifted.
Sure.
So yeah, always ask, because I'd rather somebody say no, not at all. Or even I've never had anybody get upset with me, but even if they were upset for me asking, I'd rather them be upset and safe than, have to be on the other side and knowing I didn't ask.
That is absolutely so true. And I'll tell you what plays a role in this a lot of times, both in terms of people being afraid to say something to someone who might be at risk, or even someone who has experienced suicide in their family. One of the things that prevents them a lot of times for getting help is the stigma that's around it. And I've never really understood the stigma around suicide, but it's relatively prevalent. And there's a lot of mean-spirited things that can be said about during that time. There's a lot of times people will say, well, they took the easy way out. I still have to deal with my problems. Not to bring religion into it. A lot of people say, well, that's a sin, and on down the line. And for those reasons, those are the things that make it hard to talk about. Those are the things that make it hard to seek help. What is your take on that?
I think that's why Light After Loss and support services on the other side are even more important, because unless you're walking this journey, you really don't get it. And I'm glad that you don't. I would rather you not get it, which means you're not walking in our shoes. And so it really is important for somebody to have a quote unquote safe space, or be around people who, even without saying anything, we get it. And I call it Suicide Island in our support groups, because you really are absolutely in a blink of an eye on this island. You feel like, I joke and say you're talking to Wilson, the volleyball, because you don't want to tell anyone, and you're embarrassed, and there's shame, and there's guilt, and there's just all of these heavy emotions. So why would you want to tell somebody? And then I think this happens more often than you would probably think it does. We often get blamed too. What didn't you do? Yeah. Didn't you see it? For me, that was 100 times. I'm a counselor. Yeah. I'm a suicide prevention specialist. So, everybody's looking at you like, what didn't you do? Or what didn't you say? Or, so yeah, you just feel like you're on Suicide Island, and nobody knows or nobody gets it.
Yes. I've mentioned this before on this podcast when it comes to addiction, mental illness, and other things. Empathy can be a hard thing to ask somebody for. You can say the words, but sometimes, unfortunately, they don't feel it until it's impacted them. And that's just a sad part of life. And I always try to put myself anyway in someone else's shoes. You never know what they are going through.
Absolutely.
You talk about postvention, and that's something that has been very much around Light After Loss. The Hope and Healing Center is their byline is a center where seeds of care, compassion, and community are planted, nurtured, and grown. Let's talk a little bit about the Hope and Healing Center and how that came about, where it's located, and the mission.
I know nobody can see me, but I want to do a little dance in my seat because it has always been a part of our mission to create the Hope and Healing Center since January 1, 2019. But, you have to, grow and get support and funding and all of those business things that I don't like to do, but you have to do. Mm-hmm. So, the Hope and Healing Center, we have an official building and it is at 3751 Berkshire Drive. So right on the corner of Berkshire and 38th. So we are excited about that. And the Hope and Healing Center just allows us to do more. So Light After Loss will still always be Light After Loss and the suicide loss survivor support system in Stark County. And our offices will be there, and we're going to transition all of our support groups and support services over to the Hope and Healing Center. But now more than ever, and I don't think anybody can really disagree, the level of loss by all the things around us is at an astronomical level.
Sure.
And so it really, I think the timing, had we opened the Hope and Healing Center in January 1st, 2019, the timing wouldn't have been right.
Yes.
Where now,
yes,
4 years later, it is perfect timing. So overdose rate is up, suicide rate is up. There's COVID loss, which is, to me, in the traumatic loss category,
sure. Yeah.
Because you can't have some of the things that you typically would have when somebody would pass. There are a lot of delayed rituals, and some people, weren't even able to have a funeral. So that complicates grief.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So that is in the mix. So the Hope and Healing Center really is going to be a grief and traumatic loss center. So no matter who you lost or how you lost them, it's going to be a safe place to come and share your story.
Here again, going from information that has been provided there, you center on people who are military or their military families, as well as the LGBTQ plus community, youth and youth survivors of suicide, and parents. Obviously, losing a child probably has to be one of the worst things that any parent can go through, but it's compounded when it's from suicide. We also want to mention law enforcement, first responders. With all that has been going on with COVID, these have become high-risk groups. And I also want you to talk about high-risk groups a little bit, and especially in regard to families who have experienced the suicide for one reason or another. When someone close to another person dies by suicide, this can be a trigger, and that person can become high risk as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So don't let me forget about that one. I'll answer the first one. High risk populations. So any population where suicide is at a higher level, and all the populations you named, the veterans, 22 veterans die by suicide every single day, which means, more loss survivors.
Sure.
Then first responders, LGBTQ, and youth. All of those are at a higher risk for suicide, which means there's a larger population of loss survivors, which is exactly why they are our target population. Right. And that just simply means that we purposely link with organizations as a referral source in order to make sure they know that Light After Loss and the Hope and Healing Center exist, and we have groups specific for them. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay.
And then the reason we do that, postvention is prevention, to kind of answer the second part of your question, is as a suicide loss survivor, you are automatically at a higher risk for suicide. So for myself, I lost my spouse. I'm female, and all of the numbers and data that I did not do tell me that I'm 16% more likely. My children are 3% more likely. I think that's very low. I just don't think there is any long-term studies or data yet.
Okay.
So I hope, through Light After Loss and the Hope and Healing Center, we collect all of that data and, we will have a better and more accurate number, because 3% just seems really low to me.
Yeah.
Having 2 children and know their struggles, 3% seems really low.
Right.
But even coworkers are 3%. So you don't even have to have necessarily a super close relationship with the person. It really is just the impact of the suicide. So Dr. Julie Sorrell, she's actually going to be our keynote speaker at our postvention convention this year. Mm-hmm. And she really is the one who has started to open the door regarding the impact of suicide, that it's not just the average 11 loss survivors, that for every suicide, 115 people are actually exposed. Mm-hmm. And that, and it could be twofold, either with it's the grief and trauma that they're dealing with, or they are already struggling. And so being impacted by somebody's suicide, their increase goes up and they become suicidal.
Right.
So postvention is kind of twofold. It's supporting those left behind and protecting those who are at high risk. So it's prevention and postvention at the same time.
Yes, that's a very important point, because those things really do tie together. I believe most people can understand, let's say husband, a spouse, whatever, child dies by suicide. It can put the rest of the family at risk because it hits so close. Like you mentioned, a lot of times, even in a work environment where you work with somebody every day, you get associated with them. What I've found very odd and maybe slightly disturbing is how suicide can become a contagion in a very large population. Let's say, for example, a very large high school, which may have thousands of students. There's a child there who dies by suicide. The vast majority of the children may not even know all the other students, but for some reason it starts to happen. Is there any insight that you have into that as to why that happens?
I have a whole lot of insight into why that happens. And that is why the messaging, they call it safe messaging, is so important after a suicide. When I kind of going back to House Bill 28, when the federal government, mandated, they didn't just mandate prevention, they mandated postvention. Mm-hmm. And part of postvention is how you talk about suicide and how you talk about the one who took their life, because the way you talk about it is going to put other people at risk. So you have other people who are contemplating suicide or contemplating making an attempt or whatever it is, even before the exposure to a death. Mm-hmm. And then somebody takes their life by suicide, they're impacted by that. And depending on the messaging we're giving around that, it is going to either increase or decrease the likelihood of them following through. Yeah. So, that you have a college campus, 1,100 students die by suicide on college campuses every year.
Wow.
Which is, again, why the mandate came down. Mm-hmm. And so when there is a suicide on college campus, the way you deal with that death on campus is postvention, mm-hmm. because you have to protect all the other thousands of students. And you do that in the 2-prong postvention. You support the ones who are directly left behind. That could be their friend group, that could be the people in their dorm, that, all of those people, you support them, but then you also increase your prevention efforts mm-hmm. in order to protect those who are already struggling and kind of on that line. And you'll never know who those people are.
Yeah.
So it is kind of 2-pronged. So when we start to, social media around suicide is our nemesis.
Yeah.
A lot of those messages are on social media and lead to clusters, contagions, that kind of stuff, where you have more than one person taking their life because we are no longer in control of the message.
Yeah. This may be a question kind of out of left field, but I'll ask it. We talked about the stigma around suicide, and it's certainly there. I could almost make the argument that it can go the other direction. There is a bizarre romanticization around suicide a lot of times. The tortured artist who cuts off his ear, the Shakespearean tragedy, not to pick on Shakespeare.
Yep.
But, I would rather take the poison than they'll not be without my love and all this. That has to, on some level, contribute to a problematic view of suicide.
Yes, that's actually one of the safe messaging markers, is to not romanticize suicide and to not give the details of suicide. And, it's a long list, but yeah, anything that makes it less desirable. So I think a hard thing for me and for those who lost someone to suicide is we're not supposed to have memorials.
Yes.
Because in some sense that honors that person in the way they died,
right,
which could be desirable by somebody who is contemplating suicide. Because when you're in that dark hole, you feel like nobody loves me. Nobody knows I exist. Nobody would miss me if I'm gone. But if thousands of people are rallying around somebody who died by suicide, then that looks really desirable.
On some level appealing. They'll remember me when I'm gone.
Yes, they'll remember me when I'm gone. And that's the romanticization. And it's hard. As somebody who's lost someone to suicide, I would love our golf outing to be the Craig Burton Memorial golf outing, but it's not, because I would never in a million years want anybody to walk in my shoes. And if that means I just have to honor Craig by swinging the golf club, then that's what I will do.
Yeah.
And that's hard. And people don't, and I think that's what makes suicide different, is that we can have a celebration of life and have memorial benches and all of those things, except when somebody dies by suicide.
Yes.
Because it keeps everybody else safe.
Absolutely. Great information. And I know that it can be difficult information to consume, but it is very, very important. You talked about where the Hope and Healing Center is located. The phone number that I have is 330-846-3630.
Yep. That's us.
Correct?
Yep.
And the email that I have, which is actually a Light After Loss email, is lightafterlossstark@gmail.com.
Yep.
Are there any other places that, of course, let me give you the website too. lightafterlossstark.org is the website. Is there any other information, places online, that Facebook page would have you that you would like to mention as a place where people can get more information?
Yeah, I feel like if you have social media, that's how a lot of people connect with us, is through social media. And I really underestimated the power of our social media pages until I stopped being an active person on social media.
Yeah.
So last year I was going through some health struggles and I just couldn't keep up with everything. So I kind of got quiet on our social media page, and somebody reached out and said, I miss your posts. And they kept me going and reminded me that, I'm strong and I can do this and I'm not alone. And I was like, oh, somebody is actually listening. So, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook. We do have a YouTube channel that has videos, informational videos on there. Goal is to do more once we get the Hope and Healing Center settled. So yeah, social media is really how most people initially connect with us, or the website, but social media has a lot larger presence than I actually thought.
Yeah, I think, as much as we knock social media, and there's a lot of problems with, there's absolutely no question, it does provide an easier step. Somebody who may not make a phone call might notice the post and get familiar with it, and it just eases them into it. So, and plus it disseminates information. So there are some very good aspects to social media as well. We've been talking to Shannon Ortiz, her organization Light After Loss. You can find it online, lightafterlossstark.org. as in reference to Stark County, Ohio, and that is .org. With the Hope and Healing Center, is there something specific in regard to a website for that?
It will be a link off of the Light After Loss page.
Okay, great. Well, obviously, if they can find their way to Light After Loss, they can find out about the Hope and Healing Center.
Yes.
My goodness, Shannon, thank you so much for the work you do. It's a topic that needs talked about more. I recently, talking about social media, I ran across a post not too long ago where a woman was talking about her son, and he died by suicide. And the paper got back to her in regard to the obituary and said, we really don't want to put that in. And she said, leave it. People need to know. Yep. And I kind of felt that was a pretty courageous thing. I presume you would concur?
Yes, I did the same for Craig and have no regrets about that because, again, I think he was the last person. We were the last people that ever thought. And if it just opens somebody's eyes to that this could happen to them, and start to ask difficult questions, I think that's what Craig would want for sure.
Sure.
That, nobody should be in that dark place alone.
Absolutely.
So being able to, have somebody else not take that avenue and know there is help and get access to services. So in regards to postvention in general, I think everybody, they always say suicide prevention is everybody's business. So is postvention.
Yes.
And I have now helped, some school districts outside of Stark County, but colleges, you have to have a postvention plan.
Yeah.
So you don't make a fire escape plan in the middle of the fire.
Exactly.
So having a postvention plan when there is a suicide, and then everybody has their role, everybody knows what to say and what not to say. This is what we do, I think what do you say to the media, that kind of stuff in order to kind of curb some of the uncontrollable messages that get out there. Mm-hmm. It's hard because we live in an instant access kind of society, but as much as we can control those messages will save lives. Absolutely. So if anybody wants help with a postvention plan, Light After Loss does that as well, along with suicide prevention trainings as well.
And just the quickest way to get in touch with you is the phone number. Would you like to give that, or another way?
Either email or phone number 330-846-3630. You can text that number. So I think people text more than they talk on the phone these days.
Oh, yes, yeah.
So we text way more than we talk, or the email. Either one is pretty instant access.
And the email is?
lightafterlossstark
@gmail.
Too many things.
Yes.
lightafterlossstark@gmail.com. There we go.
There we got it. Okay, very good. Shannon, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much for the work you do. It's so valuable in this community. Once again, this podcast, the Hope Discovered podcast, is provided by ComQuest, and you can find out more about ComQuest. We have, I would say, our pillars would be mental health, social outreach, and addiction recovery. ComQuest.org, real easy to find. Our phone number 330-455-0374, ComQuest.org. Thank you again, Shannon.
Thank you for having me.
It's certainly an honor to have you here. I always say people like you make the world a better place.
Aww.
And I just talk about it, but you actually make the world a better place. Thank you so much for what you do. And once again, for our listeners, thank you very much for listening to our podcast, and we will talk to you again very soon.